What would Godzilla's power level be? A pretty simple question, and one that has been asked at least a couple of times before, but usually to laughably lackluster results. So in today's video, we will be basing primarily off of the canon of the series, from original Dragon Ball to Super, to deduce how powerful Godzilla would read on those scouters, and why some would break them in an instant. Now, contrary to the ramblings you've probably heard several times before, no, power levels aren't bullshit. They never were. In fact, they are actually very honest. Too honest, in fact. That's why they got rid of them. From the very beginning, the entire point was that relying solely on the initial combat reading as the one and only factor of a fight in Dragon Ball did not work that way. Also, our main characters suppress their true power, meaning that the villains would get an inaccurate low-balled reading. That's why a scouter's reading wasn't accurate, not because the number's wrong, but because they aren't reading the true strength. The actual number is accurate. So accurate, in fact, that's why Toriyama got rid of them. Because if you knew from the start one character had a higher level of strength, it would be too revealing of who would win. So, with those morons dealt with, how could it apply to other series? Well, I think the most reasonable way to do this is to take similar feats performed by the character in question and compare it to the power levels presented in the series, and what those characters were capable of. Now, of course, power levels are not linear early on, however they seem to streamline to be basically linear by the Namek saga. With that in mind, I think it's fair to say that if a character, like Godzilla, moonbusts like Roshi did, with a power of 139, I think it's fair to say that Godzilla would at least be at that same level of 139. Of course, there are levels beyond numbered figures for the series. For example, Cell does not have an official power level, but is capable of solar system level feats, like several Godzillas are. Thus, those levels will be a bit more speculation. Furthermore, it also depends on if we are using the anime or the manga, because Toei, for some reason, decided to crank the fuck out of the power reading for the characters. In the Saiyan saga, the threats were presented as primarily planet-level enemies, yet in the anime, their feats are so impressive, done so quickly and casually, that even planet and moon busts generate energy hundreds if not thousands of times higher than what's needed to split open the moon or planet Earth. In fact, Vegeta casually demonstrated the power to blow up even a small star when destroying planet Arlia and its moon. Of course, Godzilla's strength is typically a subject of contention, mostly because people seem really adamant of making him as weak as damn possible, because they refuse to accept that things like size doesn't really matter, and that Godzilla's strength has been well above what size alone would grant for literal decades. Also, the power rankings for versions that are on par with later Dragon Ball arcs like Super, where we have no official power levels really, are going to be a bit harder to tell. I mean, I guess you could just cop out and give them an infinite, but honestly that feels like cheating a little bit. Let's go through several incarnations to find out exactly what their power level reading would be. First, let's start with the famous guy, Monsterverse Godzilla. As talked about numerous times before, I believe the consistent rating for Monsterverse Godzilla's level of strength is somewhere in the Dwarf Star ranges at this point in time, mostly thanks to stuff in the novelizations, which are canon even if they contradict the films to some extent. If you really want to be hypercritical, then the movies and graphic novels themselves tend to just demonstrate like multi-continental feats, granted performed by even garbage monsters that Godzilla no diffs, so it seems possible that he could still be moon level even off that alone. Also, with his multipliers, he would just hit that tier anyway. Evolved Godzilla is currently about 20 times stronger than his normal base form, and yet even super weakened versions of Godzilla could overpower Hollow Earth gravity, which is likened to that of the entire planet. Also, Ghidorah and Shimo have several planetary level statements for just the films alone. Now, several channels before me have attempted to show reasons for power levels applying to characters that do not have official figures, such as DBZ Mackie and my friend Christian Kember. So I'm not the first to do this, and I will be deriving both off of their methods and explaining my own. If we are using manga-based power levels, Monsterverse Godzilla's base form sitting at a comfortable 43 Rona tons of TNT, or the 10 to the 38 or 39 degree joules, would put his attack strength comfortably close to Namek Saga characters, and using methods that are much more generous to Dragon Ball proper, like lower forms of Frieza, who destroyed Planet Vegeta with such force in Dragon Ball Super, which is canon to at least the manga. This means that his power would read at over 92,000 during Godzilla vs. Kong. He was weakened to some extent here. I say about twice, some say more, others less. He doubled his combat power in his evolved form, so we could comfortably say that he would be at least 42,000 in that state, and he can multiply that power by another 10 times when using the Spiral Beam, which would put evolved Godzilla at his full strength at a power level of nearly 1,845,000 to be specific. However, his speed stuff would be a bit lacking. His speed-based power level would average to roughly about the speed of light, which characters in Dragon Ball reach at a power of about 180, as shown by Kid Goku at that level, dodging light from the solar flare, and several laser beams. So what do we do with a character who has an attack stat of 845,000, but a speed stat of only 180? Well, one could simply take the average, but I don't think that's really fair, as the stats are so skewed. You could also try to use a logarithmic equation to figure it out based on the two stats, which comes to a more impressive figure. So as we can see, Monsterverse Godzilla, even at the consistent ends, is an impressive force indeed. But what about the high ends? Well, as we know, if we take stuff from the Monarch Apple TV series, multiple novelizations, and several author statements at absolute face value, then we get a Godzilla whose atomic breath outputs more power than a gamma ray burst, supermassive black hole, supernova, or pulsar star. For manga-based figures, the answer is pretty simple in that we do not have an official power level high enough to be at this level. However, we could try to estimate based off comparisons to Frieza and later characters. But anime-wise, this isn't overpowered actually, as the Namek Saga has a couple of feats that are more impressive. So if we use anime-based power levels, then Monsterverse Godzilla in base form would start off with a much higher level. His power level in base form would be well over 1 million. You might say, well, hey, wait a minute now. That doesn't add up too much. How is he only weaker than the lower estimate for evolved? And well, that answer is pretty simple. A, mostly the multipliers. Now you could be hypercritical and try to say that the evolved multiplier is linear, whereas Dragon Ball ones are exponential, but Kaioken, which the form is likened to, is pretty consistently shown to be a linear increase of power, speed, durability. And B, the anime scaling is significantly higher than the mangas, as we've talked about before. Definitely nothing to sneeze at, and this is when he's weakened during GVK, let alone when he's stronger at his full strength. And of course, once we start multiplying this for the evolved increases, it gets much higher. Burning Godzilla is significantly stronger than evolved, but quantifying the difference is a bit hard to do at this point, since evolved has at least some implications of being compared to burning. This does drag the likely Burning Godzilla multiplier down by a good margin. Some may be a little disappointed by that numerical stat, but remember, in the anime continuity, Frieza, with 50% of his strength, deleted multiple solar systems. So I think Godzilla, compared to even a fraction of that, is remarkably impressive for him. Now that we've established how one can convert energy feats into power levels for the Monsterverse Godzilla, we get pretty impressive results, with him being somewhere between the Saiyan Saga and Namek Saga pretty consistently throughout the board. The only arguable hindrance would be his speed. With him only being about the speed of light, this would put him closer to characters earlier in the series who have light speed feats with power levels of about 180 or so. Or at the lowest lows of possible argument, somewhere maybe in the low thousands. However, I do not think that would register if one is attempting to read Godzilla's combat strength. Even in the Monsterverse itself, when they base Godzilla's energy readings, they are typically referring to the radiation that they can tell is stored in his body. Though that method is pretty inaccurate and does not mean that evolved is stronger than burning. cope them all. That said, how would we apply this to other versions of the character? Well, we can take their various feats of strength and ability and put them into several converters. Now that we've set a standard with Monsterverse specifically, we can then apply this to the rest of the series, with other versions of the character having much higher feats and much lower ones. So let's start with a few of those lower levels of Godzilla, for example. Shin and Minus One. Shin Godzilla displayed a fairly overblown but still notable feat of his atomic breath blasting through numerous buildings, melting them in an instant. If one only takes this level of power, then Shin Godzilla's amount of energy comes out to about a few kilotons to a few dozen kilotons to possibly low megatons of energy output, roughly equal to that of the majority of nuclear weapons. If one is to apply this to the manga basis of power levels, this would give Shin Godzilla an energy reading of about 60, which, considering how low he is on the totem pole compared to other versions of Godzilla, this is a pretty impressive figure. However, again, as we know in the anime has a far higher scale of physical power, and so this sadly becomes just about 36. However, Shin has actually a bit of hope, because thanks to a pseudo-canon temperature given to the beast, his atomic breath is roughly about 160,000 degrees Celsius, putting his attack power at a fairly impressive 3.1 to the 18 joules, or 740 megatons of TNT equivalent, or a power level of 81.6. His durability and physical strength are significantly lacking compared to his atomic breath, and I'm pretty sure everyone will agree on that. Minus One. Godzilla Minus One displayed a pretty impressive 17 megaton worth atomic breath when he destroyed Ginza in the film. This translates to a power level of 67.93, which would probably read as 68. You might ask, well, hold on now, why is it not much higher than Shin Godzilla's? And the answer would be that the power levels increase at a bit of an exponential rate, as we've talked about beforehand. Now that we've set a lower bar with some weaker versions of the character, how about instead we bring up some higher level versions? Godzilla Earth, in his last film The Planet Eater, displayed the impressive ability to destroy several small black holes with his atomic breath, a physically impossible feat for any amount of energy that we've seen in the normal universe. Not even the likes of a gamma ray burst could do something of this level, which makes sense since gamma ray bursts tend to come out of black holes anyway. With the most current up-to-date calculations, we can put this at an impressive at 3.17 times 10 to the 57 joules. Enough to destroy multiple solar systems. But what would that be in terms of power level output? Well, going off the anime's exponential power increases, this would get Godzilla Earth a whopping 34 million. And Godzilla Earth would grow even stronger than this if placed against such an enemy. And if we place this back into the manga's reading, well, that would be a much higher reading. For reference, manga-wise, this would be a level of power you don't really see until the Buu Saga, as even Cell, when super perfect and even stronger than before, boasted that he can only destroy a single solar system. Godzilla Earth would dwarf that in terms of raw power. His speed is, again, lacking, however. Even with this speed, though, that would be a pretty impressive power reading. Godzilla Earth is one of the higher tier Godzillas from the normal media. Of course, once you venture into comics, manga, and anime, you do get some pretty impressive contenders of their own, but film-wise, there are only two incarnations that are above Godzilla Earth: Showa Godzilla and Heisei Godzilla, both of whom have displayed massively impressive feats, potentially on the scale of destroying the universe and beyond. Such numbers would only be used by the likes of Dragon Ball Super characters, which of course there are no official power levels for, as their strength has simply gotten so absurd long before this that it would seem absurd to try putting numbers to it. With only a joking remark of Golden Frieza having a power level of 100 quintillion. You could also probably just pull a cop-out and say, well, if they have infinite physical power on the third dimensional scale, they would have an infinite power level reading. But that seems a little cheap. Before we talk about the cosmic juggernauts, however, let's talk about a few more mid-level Godzillas. We've already gone over Legendary, so now we're going to tackle his most thematic rival, in my opinion, Final Wars Godzilla. This version of Godzilla displays numerous planetary level statements, with some of the calculations for his impressive feats reaching the large planetary and possibly higher ranges, outputting hundreds to even thousands of times the power needed to destroy planet Earth, which may seem a bit absurd at first, but consider the fact that he did withstand the cosmic class firepower of Kaiser Ghidorah and didn't just immediately turn into ash. Which, if we are generous and assign that this refers to similar levels from star-destroying monsters in other series, could potentially put Kaiser Ghidorah at a Starbuster. With such noted, this would mean that his normal power level from the manga would be an impressive 381,643. Quite a bit lower than Monsterverse Godzilla's, but still rather impressive. In the anime, however, it would unfortunately be a much lower 5,974. This is still not all that bad, however, considering the fact it puts him above characters like Nappa from the Saiyan saga, though he would be pretty quickly handled by the likes of Vegeta, and likely Saiyan saga Goku as well. However, what about his impressive power-up that he received at the end of the movie? Despite measuring at infinite power in the Gotenga's energy readings, this version of Godzilla has a pretty calculable feat, destroying Kaiser Ghidorah with likely subatomic properties given, well, it's Godzilla's radiation and all, and the massive increase compared to his normal base form in terms of power means that heavenly amped Final Wars Godzilla would have a red spiral ray power level of about 6.9 million, which for reference would be enough to destroy even large stars, comparable to the yield of supernova. And for the first time in this list, the Godzilla would not really be all that hindered by their speed, because Final Wars Godzilla displays numerous impressive speed feats. Based on his impressive speed showings, this would net Final Wars Godzilla's speed at a power level of 700.5, much faster than any of the other Godzillas put up to this point. If one were to do an average, then this would mean Final Wars Godzilla would read on a Scouter actually higher than Monsterverse Godzilla, despite the disparity in their level of power. Which, don't get your hopes up, Final Wars boys. MV is still stronger in 2025. Of course, in a fight, Monsterverse Godzilla would be superior. But this is simply how the number would read out. Doing an average, MV Godzilla's base form would come out to around the 60,000s or so, whereas Final Wars would read at almost 100,000, comparable to some extent to Goku from when he arrived on Namek, if not a little bit stronger. So this is one of those examples where the red power level would not be correct in determining a victor of a fight. For a few other versions of the character, Godzilla 2000 with his above nature level radiation statements would have a power level of between 7,930 and 12,960. The Godzilla from the Kiryu series, since he scales to some early Showa feats, would have a power level of 219,256 to 754,363. For reference, this puts him roughly in the ballpark of First Form Frieza or so. The original Godzilla, due to boiling the ocean with 100 million degree temperatures, would have a power level between 104 to 148. GMK Godzilla, being the same one but even more powerful, would have a power reading between 123 and 179. You may have noticed the exponential increases in power already. Godzillas with nuke tier feats are down in the 60s, whereas the ones that can probably pop continents aren't even 3 times higher than that in the readings rating. The Godzillas that can decimate large planets and even smaller stars are well within the tens of thousands, if not more. But what about absolute behemoths? We're going to talk about the 4 strongest film Godzillas to a small extent. This is Heisei Godzilla, Showa, Godzilla Earth, and, surprisingly, the Godzilla from vs. Megaguirus. Now, how strong are these guys? These guys are all much more powerful than anything in the physical universe. Even the weakest of the bunch, Giragoji, is able to blow up a black hole. Such a feat would be impossible for anything in the real world. Gamma ray bursts, galaxies colliding together. Even two black holes meeting and clashing together does not produce such force as to actually blow a black hole up beyond its gravitational force. I say all that to explain that this midget Goji has a power tier of multi-solar system level. Yes. The black hole itself is still in those star to solar ranges, but actually blowing it up demonstrates physical power far beyond anything we've talked about up to this point in time. Even with the most conservative of power level estimates, this would get an impressively mighty 176,272,621. For Dragon Ball reference, this is stronger than Final Form Frieza and Namek Saga Goku. And he did that after his energy was drained, implying he'd be even stronger than that at his peak. Now what about the big boys? Showa Godzilla. By the end of the Showa era, if we use conservative multipliers for the feats performed on the solar and higher feats from earlier in the series, Showa Godzilla is sitting comfortably at the high end of multi-solar system level, being able to output roughly 3 to the 64 joules, putting a conservative power level for Showa Godzilla well within the 678 million territory. With higher implied feats for the Showa era, this would get their power much more impressive. There are several statements that King Ghidorah can destroy anything in the universe, which possibly includes the black holes within the series, which are much larger than those of real life at an average. The average Showa era black hole being hundreds of times more massive than the sun. If he did actually manage to destroy a black hole with his gravity beams, this would get him, likely, a power level of well over 5.3 billion. And this is a conservative figure. I'm still going back through the old Showa era again, and finding that there are much more impressive power-ups than anything I've talked about on the channel up to this point, so stay tuned for that. Now for the strongest. At a conservative estimate, a single cell from Heisei era Godzilla surviving numerous supernovae and a supermassive black hole. Applying this to the full body of these gigantic creatures like Biollante, Space Godzilla, and Godzilla himself means that even early monsters like Biollante would, at a low end, have a power level of over 604 million. And at the higher end of those calculations, Biollante would be well within the 6.58 billion territory. As mentioned, Biollante has a pretty casual existence power level of well over 600 million into the billions, and a low percentage of power weakened by anti-nuclear bacteria. 80-meter Heisei incinerated her several times, putting his attack strength between 7.4 billion and 134 billion, let alone at full power. And this is with the most scrutinous power level calculator I could possibly find. And he would get much stronger in his 100-meter state until he reached his eventual death as Burning Godzilla. So never let it be said that Godzilla is a weakling. Even compared to one of the most typical battle shonen in general, higher tier Godzillas are well within the tier of higher end characters from the series. And if you want to see this coverage of Godzilla vs. Dragon Ball, Marvel, DC, or other impressive series, stay tuned because I plan to head into the cosmic territory myself. To have the strongest fight the strongest, gods clashing for the title of king. gods clashing for the crown. Stay tuned.